The mahogany table at my brother Tom's country estate could seat 50 people comfortably. But with our entire extended family gathered for our annual reunion, even this massive dining room felt cramped with the weight of what was about to happen. I had just finished telling my nephew about my morning shift at the steel factory when I felt my daughter Victoria's presence behind me, her expensive perfume cutting through the aroma of roasted lamb and vintage wine that filled the room. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years learning how to walk in designer heels, her silk dress rustling against the leather chairs as she made her way around the table to where I sat. In her perfectly manicured hand, French tips gleaming under the crystal chandelier, she held a cream-colored envelope that looked as expensive as everything else she owned. The conversation around us continued, 43 family members catching up on the year's events, children running between adults' legs, my sister Margaret laughing at something her husband whispered, but I could feel the shift in energy as Victoria approached. Like the air pressure dropping before a storm. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she had developed since marrying Marcus, pitched just loud enough to draw attention from the nearby relatives. "Your welfare check for the month." She slid the envelope across the polished wood surface toward me, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light and sending small rainbows dancing across the walls. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and I watched as conversation died in waves spreading outward from our spot at the table. Champagne flutes pausing midway to lips, forks hovering over plates, my brother Tom's jaw tightening as he understood what was happening. My hand, still bearing the calluses from this morning's shift at Steelworks Industrial, remained flat on the table as I looked at the envelope, then up at my daughter's face, searching for any sign of the little girl who used to wait by the window for me to come home from work, who would run into my arms regardless of how dirty my uniform was, who would tell anyone who listened that her daddy was the strongest man in the world. The silence stretched like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point, and I could feel every eye in the room on us, waiting to see how Frank Thompson, the family's blue-collar embarrassment according to my daughter's recent comments that had filtered back to me through concerned relatives, would handle this moment of public humiliation. Marcus, my son-in-law, stood beside Victoria with his hand on her shoulder, his Harvard class ring prominent as always, his expression carrying that mixture of pity and superiority I had grown accustomed to over the 5 years since they had married. He was everything I wasn't, with his soft hands that had never known manual labor, his portfolio of investments that he loved to discuss at these gatherings, his vacation home in the Hamptons that he had inherited from his father, never having to work for any of it. I could see him preparing to intervene, probably to make some comment about how there was no shame in accepting help from family. The same speech he had given me last Christmas when Victoria had tried to give me a check that I'd quietly returned to her mailbox the next day. "I'm working 7 days at 2 factories. Victoria," I said, my voice cutting through the silence with the same precision I used when training new workers on the factory floor, calm but carrying an edge that made several relatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I haven't missed a single shift in 15 years, not even when your mother was dying. Not even when the doctor said I should take time off for my back. Not even when you were getting married and asked me to take a week off to help with preparations." The grease under my fingernails, which I had tried so hard to clean before coming here, but which never quite came out completely, seemed to throb with their own presence as I pushed the envelope back toward her, the paper making a soft whisking sound against the wood that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment, a crack in the facade she had built over years of country club lunches and charity galas, before she reinforced it with a small laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Dad, we've discussed this before, and I thought you understood that Marcus and I are just trying to help you have a better quality of life in your retirement years, especially considering the dangerous conditions at those factories you insist on working at, despite our repeated offers to support you financially." Her words came out in a rush, as if she had rehearsed them, and I noticed how she avoided looking directly at my hands, the ones that had held her through countless nights of childhood fever, that had taught her to tie her shoes, that had applauded until they were raw at every school play and graduation. Marcus cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly, his cologne overwhelming the closer he got, nothing like the honest smell of metal and sweat that had been my signature for decades. "Frank, there's no shame in accepting help from family, especially when that family has been blessed with financial success that allows us to care for our elders properly and Victoria is simply trying to ensure you can live comfortably without destroying your body in those factories that, let's be honest, aren't suitable for a man of your age. He gestured around the room with his wine glass, the burgundy liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim, encompassing the obvious wealth on display from various family members who had found success in real estate, medicine, and technology. Look at Tom. He retired at 55 to enjoy his grandchildren. And Margaret's husband sold his business and they travel the world now. So why do you insist on this prideful stance that helps no one? The mention of pride made something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest, because they had no idea what pride really meant, what it cost, what it built, and what it could endure. My sister Margaret tried to intervene, bless her heart, saying something about how everyone should just enjoy the meal. But Victoria waved her off with the casual dismissal of someone who had forgotten what it meant to be dismissed herself. Aunt Margaret, this is between Dad and me, and it needs to be addressed because I'm tired of lying to my friends when they ask what my father does for a living. Tired of making excuses for why he can't attend events because of his work schedule. Tired of seeing him age before his time because he's too stubborn to accept help. The room seemed to contract around those words, and I saw my brother Tom's face darken with anger on my behalf. Saw Aunt Rose open her mouth to say something before catching my eye and closing it again, remembering a promise made long ago in a hospital waiting room, while Victoria fought for her life 3 floors above us. The envelope sat between us like an accusation, its cream surface pristine and untouched by the world that had shaped my hands, and I found myself thinking of Sarah, my wife, gone these 8 years but still present in moments like these, her voice echoing in my memory with the words she had spoken from her hospital bed, gripping my hand with what little strength remained in her cancer-ravaged body. "Frank," she had whispered, her voice barely audible over the beeping machines, "promise me you'll never let her know about the money, about what we sacrificed, because children shouldn't carry the weight of their parents' struggles. But promise me something else too, that if she ever forgets where she came from, if she ever looks down on you for the choices we made together, you'll remind her of what love really looks like." I had promised, of course holding her hand until it went cold, but I had hoped this day would never come, that Victoria would remember on her own, that the values we had tried to instill would survive her ascent into wealth and privilege. "You know what, Victoria?" I said, standing slowly, my back protesting from the 12-hour shift I had finished just 3 hours before driving here. But I kept my expression neutral as I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket, the only suit jacket I owned, purchased 15 years ago for Sarah's funeral, and worn to every family event since. "Since you're so concerned about my welfare and so embarrassed by what I do for a living, maybe it's time you learned exactly why I work 7 days a week at 2 factories, why I have chemical burns on my arms that I hide under these sleeves, why I chose to destroy my body as you so eloquently put it." The documents in my pocket felt heavier than the steel beams I moved every day, heavier than the industrial drums of chemicals I processed every night, heavier than the 23 years of secrets they represented. The first paper I pulled out was worn from folding and unfolding, the letterhead of St. Mary's Hospital faded but still legible, and I smoothed it on the table with deliberate care, taking my time while the room held its collective breath. "Do you remember this place, Victoria? St. Mary's Hospital. Pediatric Oncology Ward, room 247, where you spent 3 years of your childhood, though you seem to have forgotten that part of your history when you're at your country club discussing your blessed life." Her face had already begun to pale, the careful makeup unable to hide the draining of color as recognition flickered in her eyes. Memories she had buried under years of comfort and privilege, starting to claw their way back to the surface. "This is the final payment receipt for your medical bills dated last week, showing the completion of a payment plan that started 23 years ago, when you were diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia at age 7, a payment plan that totaled $500,000 beyond what our insurance would cover, which at the time might as well have been $5 million for what we had in the bank." I let the number hang in the air, watching as Marcus's confident expression began to crumble, his hand reaching for the back of a chair to steady himself as the implications started to sink in. "Every dollar of that came from these factories you're so ashamed of. From the hazard pay at Chemco Industries, where I work the night shift handling industrial acids that eat through steel if you're not careful. From the overtime at Steelworks, where I've been a floor supervisor for 5 years, though I never mentioned the promotion because you had already made it clear. You were embarrassed by my blue-collar existence, Victoria's mouth opened and closed without sound, her carefully practiced poise crumbling like wet paper as I pulled out the second document. A worn notebook filled with 23 years of meticulous records. Every payment noted in my cramped handwriting, every extra shift logged, every sacrifice documented in blue ink that had faded to gray. Would you like to know what those two factories really mean, Victoria? Let me paint you a picture of what welfare really looks like, since you seem so concerned about my financial situation. I opened the notebook to a random page, running my finger down columns of numbers that represented more than mathematics, that represented choices and consequences and love distilled into its purest form. January 2002. You were 9 and relapsed. Needed experimental treatment that insurance classified as investigational and therefore not covered. So I took the hazmat certification course at Chemco and started working with the most dangerous chemicals they had because it paid triple rate for night shift. I flipped through more pages, each one a testament to decisions that had seemed impossible at the time, but inevitable in retrospect. March 2005, your maintenance therapy alone was costing $1,800 a month. So I picked up weekend shifts at Steelworks, told you I was helping a friend with his business so you wouldn't worry about money, missed your soccer games but made sure your mother could be there, with the video camera so I could watch them. Later on my lunch breaks, the notebook pages rustled in the silence that had descended like a heavy blanket over the room, even the children sensing something momentous was happening and staying quiet in that instinctive way kids have when adults are dealing with serious matters. June 2008, your final round of treatment, the one that finally put you in full remission, required a specialist from Switzerland who charged $40,000 for a 2-week consultation. So I sold my father's watch, the one he wore in Korea, the one he gave me on his deathbed, told you I had lost it so you wouldn't feel guilty, and picked up a third job that I worked for 6 months until my body literally collapsed and Tom had to drive me to the emergency room. Tom nodded slowly from his seat, his eyes glistening with unshed tears as he remembered that night, finding me unconscious in the factory parking lot, my body finally pushed beyond its limits. The doctors saying I was lucky I hadn't had a heart attack from the combination of exhaustion and chemical exposure. Your uncle wanted to pay for your treatment then, I continued, looking at Tom with gratitude for his silence all these years. But I couldn't accept it because this was my responsibility, my privilege as your father. My way of showing you that love isn't about words or money, but about what you're willing to sacrifice without expecting anything in return. Marcus had found his way to a chair, slumping into it with the envelope still visible on the table between us, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, shame, and something that might have been respect if I cared enough to look closer. Victoria stood frozen, her designer dress seeming suddenly gaudy against the backdrop of revealed truth, her hands shaking as she reached for the notebook, touching it like it might burn her fingers. But you told me Mom's life insurance covered the medical bills, that the house was already paid off when we lost it, that everything was fine financially. Everything was fine, Victoria, because you were alive and getting better, and that was all that mattered to us, but fine is relative when you're working 100-hour weeks and sleeping in your car, between shifts to save gas money. I pulled out another document, this one newer, crisp white paper with the Chemco Industries logo at the top. This is my employment record from Chemco, showing 15 years of perfect attendance. Not one sick day, not one vacation day, not one personal day, because every day I missed was money that wouldn't go toward your debt. And that debt was a privilege to pay because it meant you were alive to be embarrassed by me now. Aunt Rose couldn't stay silent anymore, her voice cracking with emotion as she stood up from her seat at the far end of the table. Frank, she needs to know all of it. About the times you went without eating so there would be enough food at home. About selling your truck and walking 8 miles to work for 2 years. About the plasma donations twice a week for that extra $100 that went straight to the medical bills. She turned to Victoria with tears streaming down her face. This woman who had been like a second mother to her during the treatment years. Your father sold his blood, Victoria. Literally sold pieces of himself to keep you alive. And you stand here offering him welfare checks like he's some charity case who couldn't take care of himself or his family. The room erupted in voices then. Family members who had kept silent for over 2 decades finally releasing their stories. Uncle Pete talking about the management position at his company that I had turned down because it didn't pay as much as factory hazard work. Cousin Michael describing finding me passed out from dehydration during a heat wave because I wouldn't spend money on air conditioning. My sister Margaret sobbing as she recounted watching me count out exact change at the grocery store, while wearing shoes held together with duct tape. Each revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow, her body swaying as if she might fall, Marcus reaching out to steady her but pulling back as if he didn't have the right to touch her anymore. "Stop," Victoria whispered. But the dam had broken and the flood couldn't be contained now. 23 years of collective silence bursting forth in a torrent of witnessed sacrifice and unspoken admiration for a man who had never asked for recognition, never sought praise, never wanted anything except for his daughter to live and thrive. "Please stop," she said louder. But I held up my hand and the room gradually quieted, all eyes turning back to me as I pulled out one more document. This one in a legal envelope with a law firm's return address. There's more. "Victoria, because you need to understand the full scope of what you're offering welfare to, need to comprehend exactly what kind of man you're embarrassed to call your father." I opened the envelope slowly, dramatically even, because if she wanted to make this public, then public it would be. "This is a letter from your maternal grandfather's estate, dated 30 years ago, 1 month after you were born, establishing a trust fund in my name for $2 million, accessible only after all medical debts for our children were paid in full. A safety net he wanted us to have that we couldn't touch until we had proven we didn't need it." The gasp that went through the room was audible, Marcus's wine glass slipping from his nerveless fingers to shatter on the marble floor. The sound sharp and final in the shocked silence that followed. The burgundy wine spread across the white marble like blood. Like all the blood I had sold, all the blood I had sweated, all the blood that had kept Victoria alive long enough to grow up and marry a man who would encourage her to be ashamed of where she came from. $2 million, Victoria, sitting in an account for 30 years, accumulating interest, now worth closer to $5 million with investments. And I could have accessed it last week when I made that final payment to St. Mary's, but you know what? I don't want it, don't need it, because I have something worth more than all the money in your husband's portfolio. I stood straighter then, my back still aching but somehow feeling stronger than it had in years, the weight of secrets finally lifting from shoulders that had carried too much for too long. I have the knowledge that every dollar I earned went toward something meaningful, that every burn on my arms represents a payment toward your life, that every missed family event and every exhausted night was an investment in your future, and that's worth more than any trust fund or welfare check could ever be. The notebook was still open on the table, and I flipped to the last page where I had written a single line after making the final payment. Debt paid in full. Love proven beyond doubt, sacrifice completed with joy. Victoria sank into a chair, her legs unable to support her anymore, tears streaming down her face and ruining the makeup that probably cost more than I made in a day, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Why didn't you tell me? All these years, why didn't you say anything about any of this?" The question hung between us like Sarah's ghost, and I could almost hear my wife's voice answering through me, the words she had made me promise to say if this moment ever came. "Because sick children shouldn't carry the weight of their survival, Victoria. But grown women who humiliate their fathers at family reunions should know exactly what that father sacrificed to give them the life they now use to look down on him." The truth of it seemed to physically strike her, her body folding in on itself as the full weight of 23 years of ignorance and the past 5 years of condescension crashed down on her shoulders. Marcus tried to speak, his voice cracking as he started to say something about not knowing, about being sorry, but I cut him off with a look that could have melted the steel I worked with every day. "You ran a background check on me when you got engaged, Marcus. Saw the bankruptcies and the liens and the financial struggles, and you decided I was a failure without asking why a man would choose poverty over letting his child die. Without considering that maybe those financial ruins were monuments to a love you couldn't understand because you've never had to sacrifice anything that wasn't handed back to you with interest." The room felt smaller now, the expensive decorations and designer clothes seeming tawdry against the backdrop of real sacrifice, real love, real human struggle that transcended the shallow measurements of success that Victoria and Marcus had used to judge me. I picked up the envelope she had offered me, holding it up to the light as if I could see through it, could divine the motivations and assumptions that had led to this moment. "You want to know what's in this envelope, Victoria? I don't need to open it to tell you it's probably $5,000. Maybe 10 if you're feeling particularly generous. What you spend on a handbag or what Marcus loses in a bad stock trade without blinking. And you thought it would be enough to buy my dignity, to purchase my acceptance of your pity. to pay for the right to be ashamed of me without guilt. I tore the envelope in half, then in quarters, then kept tearing until it was confetti that I let fall onto the wine-stained floor. Each piece a rejection of the narrative she had constructed about who I was and what I was worth. I don't need your welfare check, Victoria, because I have something you've forgotten existed, something called purpose, called meaning, called the knowledge that every scar on my body tells a story of love that your money can't buy and your shame can't erase. The pieces of paper settled like snow around Marcus's broken glass, and I thought how fitting it was, these two symbols of shattered assumptions and broken pride, mixing on the floor of my brother's expensive home. Let me tell you what I do need. Though, I continued, my voice gaining strength as I felt Sarah's presence so strongly it was like she was standing beside me, her hand on my shoulder giving me the courage to say what needed to be said. I need you to go to your country club tomorrow and tell them the truth about your welfare case, Father. Tell them about the man who worked 2 factories for 23 years to pay for experimental treatments. Tell them about the supervisor who still chooses night shift hazard work because it pays for other families at St. Mary's going through what we went through. Tell them about the building owner who charges below market rent to immigrant families because he remembers what it's like to count every penny. Victoria's head snapped up at that, confusion mixing with the tears on her face. Building owner? What building? You live in that tiny apartment above the deli. The laugh that escaped me then wasn't bitter or angry, but genuinely amused at how little she knew about my life, how completely she had written me off as a failure without ever asking about my reality. I own the building, Victoria. Bought it 10 years ago with savings from those factory jobs you despise. Live in the smallest unit and rent the other 7 apartments to families who remind me of us when you were sick. Families who need a break, a chance, a landlord who understands that sometimes the rent needs to wait because the children need medicine. Tom cleared his throat, adding his voice to the revelation. Your father owns 3 buildings now, Victoria, all in the immigrant district, all operated at just enough profit to maintain them while keeping rents affordable for working families. And he does the maintenance himself on Sundays, his only day off, because hiring someone would mean raising rents. The look of complete bewilderment on Victoria's face would have been comical if it wasn't so tragic. This complete reimagining of who she thought I was, this shattering of the narrative she had constructed to justify her embarrassment and condescension. But that's not all, I said, pulling out my phone and showing her a photo from last week. Me standing with a group of men and women in factory uniforms, all of us smiling despite the exhaustion evident in our faces. These are my co-workers, my real family as I've come to think of them, people who have never once been ashamed to know me, who trust me to train their children when they start at the factory, who come to me for advice about everything from work safety to college applications for their kids, who know my story and respect it instead of being embarrassed by it. I swiped to another photo, this one of me at St. Mary's Hospital, sitting with a young couple while their child received treatment. This is where I spend my vacation days, the ones I finally started taking after your debt was paid, sitting with parents going through what we went through, telling them it's possible to survive it, that the bills can be paid, that their children can grow up to be successful even if they might one day be ashamed of the sacrifice it took. The silence that followed was different from before, not shocked or tense, but contemplative. Everyone in the room recalibrating their understanding of success and failure, of pride and shame, of what it meant to truly love someone beyond the boundaries of comfort and convenience. Victoria stood slowly, unsteadily, her expensive heels clicking on the marble as she walked around the table to where I stood. Her face a canvas of emotions I hadn't seen since she was young, before money and status had calcified her heart into something I didn't recognize. Dad, she started, her voice small and broken, I don't know how to apologize for this. Don't know how to take back 5 years of disrespect and disappointment. Don't know how to make this right. You start by understanding that I never wanted an apology, Victoria. Never needed your approval or your money or your validation, because I had something more important. The knowledge that you were alive and healthy and free to make your own choices, even if those choices included being ashamed of me. I reached into my pocket one more time, pulling out a small worn photo of Sarah holding Victoria as a baby, both of them smiling despite the IV in Victoria's tiny arm, despite the hospital gown, despite everything. Your mother would be heartbroken to see what you've become, Not because you're successful or wealthy, but because you've forgotten that success isn't measured in dollars and wealth isn't calculated in possessions, that the richest man in this room is the one who knows exactly what his love is worth because he's paid the price for it in full. Marcus finally found his voice. Standing on shaking legs, his usual corporate confidence completely shattered. Frank, God, what have we done? I convinced her you were too proud to accept help, that you were stubborn and difficult, that you were choosing poverty out of some misguided principle, and all this time you were... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to articulate the magnitude of his misunderstanding and mischaracterization of a man he had dismissed as beneath consideration. All this time you were the kind of man I pretend to be at charity galas, talking about sacrifice and giving back while never actually sacrificing anything that matters. The difference between us, Marcus, I said, not unkindly but with a firmness that brooked no argument, is that you've never had to choose between your comfort and someone else's survival. Never had to decide between your dignity and your child's life. Never had to calculate how many pints of plasma you can sell before it affects your ability to work a 16-hour shift. I looked at him directly. This soft man who had inherited everything and earned nothing, who measured worth in stock portfolios and country club memberships. I don't blame you for not understanding, but I do blame you for not asking. For assuming that because my hands are dirty and my back is bent that I'm somehow less than you, somehow in need of your charity or your pity. The room had become a confessional, each family member seeming to examine their own assumptions and judgments, their own definitions of success and failure. Cousin Jennifer, who had always been kind but distant, spoke up from her corner of the table. I remember when you were working 3 jobs, Frank, when Victoria was going through her worst period, and I offered to help with groceries and you thanked me but said you had it covered, and I thought you were being proud. But now I understand you were protecting Victoria from knowing how bad things were, weren't you? I nodded, remembering those days when I had eaten nothing but peanut butter sandwiches for weeks so Victoria could have proper meals, when I had walked to work in snow because gas money meant less medication money. Every choice was calculated, I admitted, feeling the weight of those years in my bones but also the satisfaction of knowing every sacrifice had been worth it. Every dollar saved on myself was $1 toward her treatment. Every meal skipped was a copay covered. Every comfort foregone was a step closer to remission, and I would do it all again without hesitation, except this time I might not hide it so well. Might let her see what love looks like when it's stripped of all pretense and reduced to its essential form. The notebook was still on the table, and I picked it up, holding it out to Victoria. This is yours now. A record of what your life cost in terms that can't be deposited in banks or invested in portfolios. A ledger of love that I kept not for recognition but so that one day, if you ever wondered whether you were wanted, whether you were valued, you could see in black and white and faded blue ink exactly how much you were worth to us. She took the notebook with trembling hands, opening it randomly and reading entries aloud, her voice breaking with each one. February 15, 2003. Sold car, walking to work now, saved $200 toward March treatment. February 28, 2003. Picked up double shifts all week, $400 extra toward medication. March 10, 2003. Tom lent $500 to be repaid when possible. Victoria responding well to new treatment. Each entry was a small window into a life lived in service to someone else's survival, a chronicle of quiet desperation and fierce determination that she had never known existed. April 2, 2003, sold wedding ring, kept Sarah's for her, told V it was being cleaned, $1,800 towards specialist consultation. That one broke her completely, the sobs coming from somewhere deep and primal as she realized that the simple band I wore wasn't even my original wedding ring but a replacement bought at a pawn shop for $20 so she wouldn't know I had sold the real one. Marcus reached for her but stopped, his hand hovering uncertainly. This man who had thought money could solve everything suddenly, understanding that some debts couldn't be paid with checks and some wounds couldn't be healed with wealth. The family watched in silence as Victoria read more entries, each one a revelation of sacrifice she had never imagined, each notation in my cramped handwriting a testament to choices made in love and desperation. You sold everything, she whispered, looking up at me with eyes that finally saw me, really saw me for the first time in years. Everything that mattered, everything that had value. You sold it all for me, and I never knew, never even suspected. Just thought we were poor because you couldn't do better, because you weren't smart enough or ambitious enough to succeed. The truth of her assumptions laid bare like that, spoken aloud in front of the entire family, seemed to physically pain her, her body curling inward as if trying to protect itself from the shame of her own words. I told people you were a failure, Dad. Told them you chose factory work because you couldn't do anything else. Made jokes about blue-collar workers while you were destroying your body to save my life. And now you know, I said simply, feeling lighter than I had in years. The burden of secrets finally lifted, even if the burden of work remained. Now you can tell people the truth about your welfare case, Father. About the man who chose love over comfort, sacrifice over success, meaning over money, and let them judge for themselves whether that makes him a failure or something else entirely. I walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn and expensive cars in the driveway, all symbols of success that meant nothing compared to the notebook in Victoria's hands, compared to the receipt from St. Mary's showing a debt paid in full. The trust fund, Victoria said suddenly, remembering that revelation from earlier. The $2 million, now $5 million, you could have accessed it last week, could access it right now, could retire and never work another day in those factories, could live like Marcus and I do, comfortable and secure, and she trailed off, perhaps hearing how hollow those words sounded now, how empty comfort and security seemed when weighed against purpose and meaning. Why won't you take it, Dad? You've earned it, God. You've earned it more than anyone I know, so why keep working, why keep destroying yourself when you don't have to? I turned from the window to face her, to face all of them. These successful people with their successful lives built on foundations they had never had to question. Because there are other Victorias at St. Mary's right now, other parents counting change for gas money to get to treatments, other families selling everything they own and it still not being enough. And I can help them because I've been them, because I understand what it's like to choose between electricity and medication, between food and copays, between dignity and survival. The truth of it seemed to fill the room, the understanding that wealth without purpose was just paper and numbers, that success without sacrifice was just luck dressed up as achievement. Every month, I donate what you call my salary to families at St. Mary's, anonymously because they don't need to know where it comes from, just that someone understands, someone cares, someone remembers what it's like to sit in those waiting rooms and bargain with God for just one more day, one more chance, one more miracle. I pulled out my phone again, showing them the thank you letters I had saved. Not addressed to me by name, but to guardian angel, an anonymous donor, and someone who understands. Letters that meant more than any paycheck or bonus or stock option ever could. This is my retirement plan, Victoria. These letters from parents who don't have to sell their wedding rings because someone helped with that month's medication. These pictures of children who are alive because someone paid for that experimental treatment insurance wouldn't cover. The room was crying now. Not just Victoria, but Tom and Margaret and Rose and even some of the cousins who had always kept their distance from the family's blue-collar embarrassment. Marcus stood abruptly, walking to where I stood. This man who had never worked a real day in his life extending his hand to me, not in condescension but in genuine respect, perhaps for the first time since we had met. Frank, I need to say this, need you to hear this from me directly. I was wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. About everything. About who you are, about what success means, about what makes a man worthy of respect. His handshake was firm, but his palm was soft. So different from the calloused grip of my factory brothers, but there was something genuine in it now that hadn't been there before. I don't need your respect, Marcus, I replied, not unkindly but with honesty that seemed important in this moment of revelation. I never did, just like I don't need Victoria's approval or anyone else's validation, because I know who I am and what I've done and why I've done it, and that knowledge is worth more than all the respect in the world from people who measure worth in dollars and status. I looked around the room at my family, these people who had watched my journey from a distance, some with pity, some with confusion, some with quiet admiration they had never voiced. The only validation I ever needed came from Sarah on her deathbed, when she held my hand and said, "You did it, Frank, you saved her, you kept every promise. And I love you for it." Victoria stood then, crossing the space between us with uncertain steps, her designer heels clicking on the marble like a countdown to something inevitable. When she reached me, she did something she hadn't done in years, not since she had decided I was an embarrassment to her new life. She hugged me, not the polite, careful embrace she gave at Christmas and birthdays, but the desperate, clinging hug of a child who had finally found her way home after being lost for too long. I felt her tears soaking through my one good suit jacket, felt her body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than regret, from the place where love lives before it gets buried under assumptions and ambitions. "Can you forgive me?" she whispered into my shoulder, and I could smell her expensive shampoo and remember the baby shampoo we used when her hair fell out from chemo. Remember holding her bald head against this same shoulder while she cried from pain. We couldn't take away but could only endure together. "Can you ever forgive me for becoming someone Mom would be ashamed of? For forgetting everything you taught me about what matters? For turning into exactly the kind of person you and Mom worked so hard to make sure I'd never have to be?" "There's nothing to forgive, Victoria," I said, holding her the way I had when she was 7 and scared, when she was 10 and sick, when she was 15 and recovering, before money and marriage had built walls between us. "You grew up and made your own choices, and if those choices led you away from me, that was your right, your freedom that I worked to give you, the ability to choose your own path even if that path didn't include respect for mine." I pulled back slightly to look at her face, seeing Sarah in her features but also seeing herself, the woman she had become, and the woman she could still choose to be. "The question isn't whether I forgive you, but whether you can forgive yourself for the years you wasted being ashamed of something that should have made you proud." The envelope pieces were still scattered on the floor, mixing with the wine and broken glass, and Victoria knelt to pick them up, her expensive dress dragging through the spilled wine without her seeming to notice or care. "I want to fix this," she said, gathering the torn paper like she could somehow put it back together, like she could undo the insult and the years of condescension that had led to it. "I want to make this right. Want to show you that I understand now, that I see you now, that I'm not that person anymore who could offer you charity while you were literally paying for my life." "Then start by telling the truth," I said, helping her to her feet, noticing how young she looked suddenly, how vulnerable without the armor of wealth and status she had worn for so long. "Go to your country club and tell them about your father who works 2 factories to donate his salary to sick children. Tell your friends about the man who sold his blood to buy your medicine. Tell your husband's family about the building owner who keeps rents low because he remembers being unable to afford rent himself." I looked at Marcus, including him in this challenge. "Tell them that real success isn't inherited or invested but earned through sacrifice. That real wealth isn't measured in portfolios but in the lives you've touched and the love you've proven through action, rather than words." Tom stood up then, my successful brother who had always been quietly supportive but never vocal about it, raising his wine glass in a toast that seemed to encompass not just me, but everything that had been revealed in this room. "To Frank Thompson," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to, "who taught us all what it really means to be wealthy, what it really costs to love someone, and what it really looks like to be successful in the ways that matter." The room raised their glasses, even Marcus with a new one hastily grabbed from the sideboard, and I stood there in my one good suit with my calloused hands and my aching back, and felt richer than I had ever felt in my life. But I wasn't done. Because there was one more thing that needed to be said, one more truth that needed to be spoken in this room full of revealed secrets and reconsidered judgments. "That trust fund," I said, causing everyone to pause with their glasses still raised. "I'm going to access it, but not for me. Not for retirement or comfort or any of the things you might expect." I looked at Victoria, at Marcus, at all of them. "I'm using it to establish the Sarah Thompson Foundation for Childhood Cancer Support, a fund that will pay for the things insurance won't cover, the experimental treatments and specialist consultations and travel expenses and all the hidden costs that destroy families who are already dealing with the worst thing imaginable." The silence that followed was profound, the kind that comes when people realize they're witnessing something larger than family drama, something that transcends personal grievance and touches on universal truth. Victoria was crying again, but these were different tears, cleaner somehow, like rain after a drought. "Mom would have loved that," she whispered, and I nodded, feeling Sarah's presence so strongly it was like she was standing beside me, her hand in mine, proud of both the man I had remained and the daughter who was finally finding her way back to who she used to be. "Your mother knew this day might come," I said, reaching into my pocket one last time to pull out a letter, sealed and yellowed with age, with Victoria's name written on it in Sarah's careful handwriting. She wrote this when you were in remission the first time. Told me to give it to you if you ever forgot where you came from. If you ever looked down on the life we built to save yours. I held it out to her. This last gift from a mother who had seen the future and prepared for it even while dying. She loved you enough to understand you might lose your way. And she loved you enough to leave you a map back home. Victoria took the letter with shaking hands, holding it like the sacred thing it was. This message from beyond the grave from a mother who had known her daughter better than her daughter had known herself. She opened it carefully, the old glue giving way easily, and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in Sarah's handwriting, weaker than usual from the chemo, but still distinctly hers. The room waited in silence as Victoria read, her lips moving slightly, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed whatever wisdom Sarah had left for this moment. When she finished, she looked up at me with eyes that held something new, something I hadn't seen in years. Understanding. Real understanding of who we had been as a family and what we had sacrificed for each other. She knew, Victoria said wonderingly. She knew I might become this person, might forget, might need to be reminded, and she forgave me for it before it even happened. She held the letter to her chest like armor against her own shame. She said love isn't about being perfect, but about finding your way back when you get lost. That you would always be my compass if I just remembered to look for north instead of looking down. The poetry of it was so perfectly Sarah that I had to smile, remembering my wife's way with words, her ability to find beauty even in the hardest moments, her gift for making wisdom sound like love and love sound like truth. Your mother was smarter than both of us, I said, and Victoria laughed through her tears. A sound I hadn't heard from her in so long I had forgotten how much she sounded like Sarah when she really laughed. Not the polite society laugh she had cultivated, but the genuine joy that came from deep inside. I want to help, Marcus said suddenly, his voice stronger now, more certain than I had ever heard it. With the foundation, I mean. I know I haven't earned the right to be part of this, but I have connections in the medical industry, relationships with pharmaceutical companies, ways to maximize the fund's impact that you might not have access to. He paused, seeming to gather courage. I want to learn what it means to actually help people instead of just writing checks at galas and calling it charity. Want to understand what you understand about sacrifice and meaning and purpose. I studied him for a long moment. This soft-handed man who had married my daughter and encouraged her worst instincts, who had helped build the walls between us with his assumptions and prejudices. But I also saw something new in his eyes. A humility that hadn't been there an hour ago. A recognition that his entire worldview had been built on sand and was now crumbling in the face of revealed truth. The foundation will need all the help it can get, I said finally, offering him a chance at redemption even though he hadn't earned it. Because that's what love does. It offers chances even when they haven't been deserved. I want to visit the factories, Victoria said suddenly, surprising everyone including herself. I want to see where you work. Meet your co-workers, understand what you do all day and night that paid for my life. Want to shake the hands of the people you call your real family and thank them for taking care of you when I didn't. She looked at her designer dress, stained now with wine and tears, and laughed ruefully. I want to see who you really are when you're not pretending to be just my father at family reunions. When you're Frank the supervisor and Frank the mentor and Frank the man who everyone respects because he's earned it through sweat and sacrifice. The factory isn't a tourist destination. Victoria, I warned, but not unkindly. It's dangerous and dirty and loud, nothing like your world of office buildings and lunch meetings, and the people there won't be impressed by your designer clothes or your husband's portfolio. Will judge you only by how you treat them and whether you're willing to see them as equals rather than curiosities. She nodded, understanding the challenge in my words, the test I was offering her to prove that this revelation had actually changed her, rather than just shamed her temporarily. I know, she said simply. That's why I need to go. Need to see it and smell it and feel it. Need to understand what you choose every day over comfort and ease. Need to meet the people who know the real you, the one I forgot existed, the one Mom fell in love with and stayed in love with even when things got impossible. She looked at Marcus, challenging him with her eyes. We both need to go, need to understand what we've been looking down on, what we've been ashamed of, what we should have been celebrating all along. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension that had been building for years finally releasing in this moment of recognition and reconciliation. But I wasn't quite done. Because there was one more thing that needed to be said, one more truth that needed to be spoken to complete this circle of revelation. There's something else you should know, Victoria. Something about those welfare checks you wanted to give me. I smiled, and it wasn't bitter or angry, but genuinely amused. I make more money than you think at those factories. With my seniority and hazard pay and supervisor salary, probably more than some of the people at your country club who look down on blue-collar work. The look of shock on her face was almost comical, this final reversal of her assumptions about my life and circumstances. But you live so simply. Drive that old truck, wear the same clothes, never spend money on anything. She trailed off, perhaps beginning to understand that choosing to live simply wasn't the same as being forced to live in poverty, that there was a difference between can't and won't when it came to spending money on things that didn't matter. Every dollar I don't spend on myself is a dollar I can give to families at St. Mary's, I explained, the mathematics of compassion that had governed my life since Victoria's recovery. Every luxury I don't buy is a treatment someone else can afford. Every vacation I don't take is a family that doesn't have to choose between gas and groceries. Every new truck I don't purchase is a child who gets to try that experimental drug that might save their life. The simplicity of it seemed to stun them. This equation that measured worth in lives rather than lifestyle. You're not poor, Marcus said slowly, understanding dawning on his face. You're just generous to the point of self-sacrifice. Giving away everything extra instead of accumulating it, measuring success by how much you can help rather than how much you can have. He laughed, but it was a sound of wonder rather than humor. You're the richest person I know, and I thought you needed welfare. Thought you were too proud to admit you were struggling, when really you were too humble to admit you were succeeding in ways I couldn't even imagine. The irony of it all seemed to hit Victoria like a final blow. This complete inversion of everything she had believed about me, about success, about what it meant to live a meaningful life. I offered welfare to a philanthropist, she said, the words coming out in a whisper of disbelief. I tried to give charity to someone who gives away more than I've ever earned. Tried to help someone who spends his life helping others. Tried to save someone who saved me in every way a person can be saved. And now you know, I said, feeling the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. The burden of secrets and silence finally dissolved in the truth of this moment. Now you can decide what to do with that knowledge. Whether to let it change you or just shame you. Whether to learn from it or just apologize for it. Whether to let it bring you back to who you used to be or push you toward who you could become. I looked around the room at my family. These people who had witnessed this unveiling of truth. This stripping away of pretense and assumption. The choice is yours, Victoria, just like the choice to be ashamed of me was yours. But now at least you're making it with full knowledge of what you're choosing between. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the sunrise I'd see tomorrow on my way to the factory. Another day of work that meant something. Another day of purpose that transcended profit. Victoria stood still holding her mother's letter and walked to the window to stand beside me, looking out at the same sunset but perhaps seeing it differently now, seeing the beauty in endings that led to beginnings. In work that looked like struggle but was really love. In fathers who looked like failures but were really heroes in disguise. I want to come with you tomorrow, she said quietly. To the factory, to your shift. Want to see the sunrise from your truck and meet the people you work with and understand what you do with your hands that paid for what I do with my life. She turned to look at me, and for the first time in years I saw my daughter again. Not the millionaire married to Marcus, but the little girl who used to wait by the window for her daddy to come home from work. Will you let me? Will you give me another chance to see you, really see you, and maybe find my way back to being someone you and Mom could be proud of? I thought about it for a moment, about the men and women at the factory who had become my family, who had supported me through Sarah's death and Victoria's abandonment, who knew my story and respected my choices and never once made me feel less than for the work I did. They would welcome her, I knew, would show her what dignity looked like when it wore work boots and carried lunch pails, would teach her what success meant when it was measured in integrity rather than income. Be at my apartment at 3:30 a.m., I said. Wear something you don't mind getting dirty, and bring work gloves if you have them, though I doubt you do, and be prepared to see what real work looks like, what real worth is built on, what real wealth means when it's counted in lives changed rather than dollars earned. She nodded. Understanding that this was a test and an opportunity, A chance to prove that this moment of revelation had actually changed something fundamental, rather than just temporarily shamed her into better behavior. Marcus stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. Would it be possible for me to come too? I know I haven't earned it, but I want to understand. Want to see what I've been missing? What I've been dismissing? What I should have been respecting all along. The humility in his voice was foreign but genuine. This man who had never asked for anything because everything had always been given to him freely. The factory doesn't care about your MBA or your portfolio, I warned him. You'll be judged by your willingness to listen and learn, by your respect for people who work with their hands, by your ability to see dignity in labor you've been taught to look down on. He nodded, accepting the terms, perhaps for the first time in his life accepting terms he hadn't set himself. 3:30 a.m., I repeated. Don't be late, because the shift starts at 4 hours whether you're ready or not. And the machines don't care about your schedule or your comfort or your assumptions about what work should look like. The family was dispersing now, the reunion effectively over, but there was something different in the way they moved, something more thoughtful, more aware, like they were seeing each other and themselves differently after what had been revealed. Tom approached me as I prepared to leave, pulling me aside with a hand on my shoulder. I should have said something years ago, he said quietly. Should have told Victoria what you were doing, what you were sacrificing. Should have made her understand instead of keeping your secret. I shook my head, appreciating the sentiment but not needing the apology. She had to come to this on her own, I said. Had to reach the point where her shame became unbearable enough to break through it. Had to offer me that envelope to understand what she was really offering and what I was really worth beyond her narrow definitions. I looked back at Victoria, who was still clutching her mother's letter, still processing everything that had been revealed. Sarah knew this would happen, planned for it, prepared both of us for it in her own way, and now it's happened and we can move forward or stay stuck, but at least we're doing it with truth instead of assumptions. As I walked to my truck, the same 15-year-old vehicle Victoria had always asked me to park out of sight, I felt lighter than I had in years despite the exhaustion from my morning shift and the emotional weight of the afternoon's revelations. Tomorrow would come early as it always did, but now it would come with witnesses, with Victoria and Marcus seeing what I did with my days and nights, understanding finally what their comfort had cost in someone else's sacrifice. The thought of Victoria in work gloves made me smile. This woman who had probably never held a tool heavier than a wine glass, learning what it meant to earn rather than inherit, to build rather than buy. The drive home was peaceful. The familiar route between Tom's estate and my apartment building, taking me through neighborhoods that shifted from mansion to working class gradually, like descending through economic strata to find reality at the bottom. My building came into view, nothing special from the outside, just another brick structure in a row of brick structures. But I knew the families inside, knew their stories and struggles and triumphs, knew that Rosa in 2B had just gotten her nursing degree, and that Ahmed in 3C had just opened his own restaurant, and that the Nguyen family in 4A had just welcomed their first grandchild. These were my people, my community, the ones who understood that wealth wasn't about what you had but about what you did with what you had. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, the smallest unit in the building but sufficient for my needs, containing everything I required and nothing I didn't. The walls were covered with photos, not of possessions or achievements but of people. Sarah on our wedding day, Victoria at various stages of childhood, the families from St. Mary's who had become part of my extended family, my co-workers from the factory who had supported me through everything. This was my wealth. These connections and relationships and impacts that couldn't be deposited in banks but that paid dividends in meaning and purpose every single day. As I prepared for bed, setting my alarm for 3 a.m. as I had every day for 15 years, I thought about tomorrow, about Victoria seeing the factory floor for the first time, meeting the men and women who had become my brothers and sisters in everything but blood, understanding finally what I did with my hands that had paid for her life. Would she be able to handle the noise and the heat and the danger? Would she be able to see the dignity in the work rather than just the difficulty? Would she understand that every burn on my arms was a badge of honor, a mark of love that her money could never buy? The photo of Sarah on my nightstand seemed to smile at me, that knowing smile she had worn when she was planning something, when she could see further ahead than the rest of us and was preparing for futures we couldn't imagine. She had known this day would come, had prepared for it with that letter, with her whispered instructions on her deathbed, with her faith that love would eventually overcome shame and truth would eventually defeat assumptions. "We did it, Sarah," I whispered to the photo. "She knows now, understands now, and maybe, just maybe, she'll find her way back to who we raised her to be." Sleep came easily despite the emotional turmoil of the day, the deep sleep of someone who had finally unburdened himself of secrets, who had spoken truth to power even when that power was his own daughter's condescension and his son-in-law's contempt. Tomorrow would be a new beginning, a chance for Victoria to see who I really was when I wasn't playing the role of embarrassing father at family reunions, when I was just Frank at the factory, respected and respectable, worthy of more than welfare checks and pitying glances. The alarm came too soon, as it always did, but I rose without complaint, as I always did, preparing for another day of work that meant something. That mattered. That made a difference in lives beyond my own. But today would be different because today I would have witnesses. Would have Victoria and Marcus seeing what their comfort was built on, understanding finally that some foundations are made of sacrifice and some structures are held together by love, and some men measure their worth not in what they accumulate but in what they give away. I dressed in my work clothes, the sturdy fabric that could withstand chemicals and heat, the steel-toed boots that had walked miles of factory floor, the thick gloves that had protected my hands through countless dangerous tasks. This was my uniform, my armor, my identity that Victoria had been ashamed of, but that I wore with pride because it represented everything I had chosen, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had built with hands that she thought were too dirty to be respectable, but that were clean in all the ways that mattered. At exactly 3:30 a.m., I heard the knock on my door, tentative and uncertain, so different from the confident way Victoria usually announced herself. I opened it to find her standing there in jeans and a sweatshirt, looking younger and more vulnerable than she had in years, with Marcus beside her in what were probably his gardening clothes, both of them looking like they were preparing for something they didn't quite understand, but were willing to face anyway. "Ready?" I asked, and they nodded, following me down the stairs to my truck. The vehicle Victoria had always been embarrassed by, but that had carried me faithfully to work for 15 years. The drive to the factory was quiet, the streets empty except for other workers heading to early shifts, the invisible army that kept the world running while everyone else slept. Victoria sat between Marcus and me, looking out at the gradually industrializing landscape as we moved from residential to commercial to industrial, from the world she knew to the world I inhabited, from comfort to purpose. The factory came into view as the first hints of dawn touched the sky, massive and imposing, breathing steam and humming with life even at this early hour. "This is it," I said unnecessarily, parking in my usual spot among the dozens of other old trucks and worn cars that belonged to my co-workers. "This is where I spend my days and sometimes nights, where I earned every dollar that went toward your treatment, where I became the man you're ashamed of and the man I'm proud to be." Victoria nodded, taking a deep breath as if preparing to dive into deep water, which in a way she was, diving into a world she had dismissed without ever seeing, without ever understanding, without ever respecting. As we walked toward the entrance, other workers began to notice us, calling out greetings to me and curious looks at my companions. "Frank," called out Jim, my shift partner for the last decade. "These the family you're always talking about?" I nodded, introducing Victoria and Marcus to the men and women who had heard their names countless times, but were now meeting them in person, seeing the daughter who had been saved and the son-in-law who had encouraged her shame. The workers were polite but reserved, waiting to see what kind of people these visitors would prove to be, whether they would be tourists or genuine seekers of understanding. Inside the factory, the assault on the senses was immediate. The heat from the furnaces, the clang of metal on metal, the sharp smell of chemicals and hot steel, the vibration of massive machines that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Victoria's eyes widened as she took it all in. This world that had paid for her world. This reality that had funded her comfortable illusions. Marcus actually stepped back, overwhelmed by the intensity of it all, perhaps understanding for the first time that some work involved more than conference calls and spreadsheets. "This is my station," I said, leading them to the area where I worked as supervisor, overseeing the team that handled the most dangerous chemicals, the ones that paid triple hazard pay because of the risk involved. This is where I spent your childhood, Victoria, monitoring temperatures and pressures and chemical reactions that could go wrong in seconds if someone wasn't paying attention, wasn't skilled, wasn't dedicated to doing the job right regardless of the danger. I showed them the safety equipment, the emergency procedures, the complexity of what looked like simple manual labor to those who had never done it. My team gathered around, these men and women who had become family, who had covered my shifts when Sarah was dying, who had celebrated with me when Victoria graduated from college even though she hadn't invited me to the ceremony. They told stories that Victoria had never heard, about the time I worked 72 hours straight during an emergency shutdown, about the time I trained the owner's son who had thought he was too good for factory work until I taught him otherwise, about the respect I had earned through competence and consistency, and caring about more than just my own paycheck. Victoria listened with tears streaming down her face, hearing about a father she had never known existed, a man who was a leader and mentor and example to people she would have dismissed as beneath her notice. Marcus was silent, watching me demonstrate the precise movements required to handle dangerous chemicals safely, understanding perhaps for the first time that intelligence came in forms that weren't taught in business school, that expertise could be earned with hands as well as heads, that dignity didn't require a corner office or a secretary. As the shift progressed, I let them shadow me, showing them what a typical day looked like, the problems that arose and how we solved them, the teamwork required to keep everything running safely and efficiently. Victoria tried to help where she could, her soft hands quickly blistering from even simple tasks, but she didn't complain, didn't ask to stop, just kept working with a determination I remembered from her childhood, from before money and status had softened her resolve. Marcus struggled more, his coordination off, his strength insufficient for many tasks, but he too persisted, perhaps driven by shame or newfound respect or simple human curiosity about a world he had dismissed without experiencing. At lunch break, we sat in the break room with my coworkers eating sandwiches from brown bags and drinking coffee strong enough to strip paint. The conversation was different from what Victoria and Marcus were used to. Not about stock prices or vacation homes, but about children's college applications and medical bills and car repairs, and the small triumphs and tragedies that made up working-class life. But there was something else too, a camaraderie and genuine care that I could see Victoria recognizing, a community built on shared struggle and mutual respect that her country club could never replicate. "Your dad's the best supervisor we've ever had," said Maria, one of the younger workers I had trained. "He knows every job on this floor because he's done them all. Never asks us to do anything he wouldn't do himself. And when my kid was sick last year, he covered my shifts for a week and wouldn't let me pay him back." She looked at Victoria with eyes that held judgment, but also hope. "We all knew about you, about what he sacrificed for you, about how you were too good to visit him here. And we never understood how Frank Thompson's daughter could be ashamed of him when we all wish we could be half the parent he is." The words hit Victoria like physical blows, each testimony from my co-workers adding weight to her understanding of what she had dismissed and denied, and been ashamed of for so long. By the end of the shift, she could barely stand, exhausted physically and emotionally from 8 hours of work that I did every day. Sometimes 16 hours when I pulled doubles, sometimes 24 hours when emergencies demanded it. Marcus looked like he had aged years in a single day, his usual confidence replaced by something more humble, more real, more worthy of respect. As we walked back to the truck, the afternoon sun harsh after the fluorescent lights of the factory, Victoria stopped and turned to look back at the building that had been my second home for 15 years. "I understand now," she said simply. "I understand now," she said simply. "I understand what you chose and why you chose it and what it cost you and what it bought me. And I'm sorry, Dad. So sorry for the years I wasted being ashamed of something that should have made me proud, for the disrespect I showed to sacrifice I didn't even know existed, for the person I became when I should have stayed the person you and Mom raised me to be. Understanding is the first step," I said, feeling the exhaustion of the shift in my bones but also the satisfaction of honest work honestly done. The question now is what you do with that understanding. Whether you let it change you or just add it to your collection of experiences, whether you use it to become better or just to feel better about yourself. I looked at both of them, these privileged people who had just spent 8 hours in my world. The factory will be here tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, and so will I, until my body can't do it anymore, or until every child at St. Mary's has what they need. Whichever comes first. Marcus spoke for the first time in hours, his voice hoarse from the factory air. I want to help, really help. Not just write checks, but actually do something meaningful with the resources I inherited but never earned. He looked at his soft hands, now blistered and dirty. I want to learn what you know about sacrifice and purpose. Want to understand how to measure worth in something other than dollars. Want to become someone who deserves to be married to Frank Thompson's daughter, if she'll still be the person Frank Thompson raised after today. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the morning's silence. This one full of processing and understanding and reevaluation. When we reached my building, Victoria didn't want to leave. Wanted to see my apartment properly for the first time. To understand how I lived when I wasn't at family reunions pretending everything was fine. She walked through my small space with new eyes, seeing not poverty but choice, not failure but priority, not shame but pride in living simply so others could simply live. She stopped at the photo wall, looking at all the faces that represented my true wealth, the families from St. Mary's, the co-workers from the factory, Sarah in all her stages from young bride to dying warrior. This is who you are, she said, not a question but a statement of understanding. This is what matters to you, these people, these connections, these impacts that can't be measured in money but that make you richer than anyone I know. She touched a photo of herself as a child, bald from chemo but smiling, held in my arms outside the hospital. This is who I was before I forgot, before I got lost, before I started measuring worth the wrong way. You can find your way back, I said, believing it for the first time since she had slid that envelope across the table at Tom's house. It's not too late to remember who you were, to become who your mother hoped you'd be, to make choices that matter instead of choices that just make money. I pulled out a business card from St. Mary's Hospital, the volunteer coordinator who was always looking for help. Start here. Start with giving back to the place that gave you back to us. Start with understanding what other families are going through right now, today, while we stand here talking about it. She took the card like it was precious, holding it carefully as if it might disappear. Will you come with me the first time? She asked, and she sounded young again, uncertain, the little girl who had been scared of the hospital until I showed her that the people there were trying to help, that fear was just love wearing a disguise. Will you introduce me to the families? Help me understand how to help without hurting, how to give without condescending, how to be useful instead of just feeling useful. Every Sunday, I promised. My one day off, we can spend it at St. Mary's, and you can learn what I learned, that helping isn't about having money to give, but about having time and presence and understanding to share, that the best gift you can give someone in crisis is the knowledge that they're not alone, that someone who's been there survived and their child can too. The possibility of it, of Victoria returning to the hospital that had saved her to help save others, seemed to complete a circle that had been broken for too long. As they prepared to leave, Marcus turned to me with something in his hand. The torn pieces of the envelope from the reunion, carefully gathered and held like evidence of a crime or a reminder of shame. What should I do with this? He asked, and I could see he was really asking what he should do with himself, with his life, with the understanding that everything he had believed about success and failure had been exactly backwards. Keep it, I said. Frame it if you want, put it somewhere you'll see it every day. And remember that real welfare isn't about money but about well-being. That real charity isn't about giving excess but about sharing essence. That real wealth isn't about what you have but about what you do with what you have. He nodded, pocketing the pieces carefully, and I could see him already planning how to rebuild himself into someone worthy of respect, someone who understood that inheritance without purpose was just luck without meaning. After they left, I sat in my apartment as the sun set, thinking about the day, about the revelations at the reunion and the education at the factory, about Victoria's tears and Marcus's humility, about the possibility of redemption and the power of truth. The photo of Sarah seemed to glow in the dying light, and I could almost hear her voice, proud and loving, saying that everything had worked out exactly as it should, that the pain had led to understanding, and the shame had led to growth, and the sacrifice had led to exactly where we were now, with our daughter finding her way back to herself. The next morning, 3 a.m. came as it always did, but when I arrived at the factory, something was different. Word had spread about Victoria's visit. about her working a full shift, about her tears and apologies and genuine desire to understand. My coworkers, these good people who had supported me through everything, seemed to stand a little straighter, pride in their work, validated by someone from the other side seeing its worth. Jim clapped me on the shoulder and said, "She's got your spine after all, Frank." Just took a while to show itself. That Sunday, Victoria met me at St. Mary's, dressed simply, her expensive jewelry left at home, her face clean of makeup, looking more like the daughter I remembered than the stranger she had become. We spent the day with families in the pediatric oncology ward, Victoria listening to their stories, sharing her own, offering hope from the perspective of someone who had survived, who had thrived, who had forgotten but remembered again what it meant to fight for life and be grateful for every day of it. I watched her with a young mother whose daughter had just been diagnosed, saw her take the woman's hands and speak words that came from experience rather than sympathy, saw her pull out her phone to show pictures of herself during treatment, bald and thin but smiling, proof that there was another side to this nightmare. The mother cried and Victoria cried with her, and in that moment I saw Sarah and our daughter again, the compassion and strength that had been buried under privilege finally breaking through. As weeks turned to months, Victoria became a regular at St. Mary's, eventually joining the board, using her connections and resources to expand the foundation I was establishing with the trust fund. Marcus threw himself into the work with surprising dedication, his business acumen actually useful when directed toward meaningful ends. His network of wealthy contacts becoming donors once they heard the story of what we were building and why. The foundation grew beyond what I had imagined, but it stayed true to its mission. No family should have to choose between their child's life and their financial survival. The factory workers started seeing Victoria regularly, as she would sometimes pick me up from shifts, bringing coffee and donuts for everyone, learning their names and their stories, becoming part of the community she had once dismissed. She started a program that provided college scholarships for factory workers' children, funded by her country club friends who she had finally told the truth about her welfare case father, the man who had chosen love over comfort and never regretted it for a second. One day, about a year after that fateful reunion, Victoria came to my apartment with something in her hand. It was a new envelope, but this one was different. Inside was a photo from St. Mary's, a little girl who had just finished treatment, holding a sign that said, "Thank you, Sarah Thompson Foundation." On the back, Victoria had written, "Dad, this is your real welfare check. Proof that your sacrifice created more than just me, that it created hope and possibility and life for people who needed it most. I'm proud to be your daughter, proud of where I came from, proud of what you chose and what it cost and what it bought. Love, Victoria." I framed that photo next to Sarah's picture, these two pieces of my heart united in purpose if not in presence. The work continued at the factory and at the hospital. The cycles of labor and giving that defined my life and now defined Victoria's too. She never again offered me money, understanding finally that what I needed wasn't welfare but purpose, wasn't charity but connection, wasn't pity but respect. She had learned what Sarah always knew, what I had tried to live, that love is action, that sacrifice is privilege, that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you give away. The trust fund money built something beautiful, not just the foundation but a movement of families helping families, of survivors supporting fighters, of love manifesting as action rather than just emotion. Victoria became known not as the millionaire who was ashamed of her father, but as the advocate who understood what families needed, because her family had needed it too. Marcus transformed from a soft-handed inheritor to a dedicated philanthropist who understood that wealth without purpose was just paper waiting to become meaningful. And I continued working at the factory, my body aging but my spirit sustained by the knowledge that every shift meant something, that every dollar earned was a dollar that could change a life, that every day of labor was a day of love made manifest. My coworkers aged with me, some retiring, new ones joining, but the respect remained, the understanding that Frank Thompson was exactly who he appeared to be, a man who had chosen love over comfort and never looked back. Sometimes, on Sunday evenings after our day at St. Mary's, Victoria and I would sit in my small apartment, looking at the photos on the walls, the faces of all the lives we had touched and been touched by. We would talk about Sarah, about what she would think of who we had become and what we were doing. about the way love could transform even the deepest shame into purposeful action. And Victoria would always say the same thing before she left. Thank you, Dad, for choosing sacrifice, for choosing love, for choosing to be exactly who you are even when I couldn't see it. The factories are still there, still running, still employing people like me who understand that dignity isn't about the work you do, but about how you do it and why. St. Mary's Hospital still treats children with cancer, but now with the support of the Sarah Thompson Foundation, families don't have to choose between treatment and survival, between their child's life and their own future. The foundation has grown beyond our city, beyond our state, becoming a model for how communities can support each other through the worst moments imaginable. Victoria never went back to being the person she was before that reunion, never again measured worth in dollars or status in possessions. She kept the torn envelope, had it framed as Marcus had suggested, hanging in their home as a reminder of the day everything changed, the day truth was revealed, the day she learned what welfare really meant and who really needed it. Their children, my grandchildren, grow up knowing the story, understanding that their grandfather works in a factory not because he has to anymore, but because he chooses to, because work has meaning beyond money and purpose beyond profit. The cycle continues, sacrifice and love intertwined, each generation learning from the last what really matters. I still drive the same old truck, still wear the same work clothes, still live in the same small apartment, but now everyone knows why, understands the choice, respects the decision. The embarrassment is gone, replaced by something stronger. The recognition that some men measure wealth differently, that some fathers pay prices that can't be calculated in dollars, that some love is so fierce it looks like sacrifice but feels like privilege. And somewhere, I know Sarah is watching, proud of the man who kept his promises, proud of the daughter who found her way back, proud of the legacy we built from sacrifice and the foundation we created from love. The welfare check was never cashed, could never be cashed, because what Victoria had tried to give me I already possessed in abundance. The knowledge that my life had mattered, that my choices had meaning, that my sacrifice had purchased something money could never buy, the transformation of shame into understanding, of condescension into respect, of a daughter lost into a daughter found. This is my story, our story. The story of what welfare really means when it's measured in love rather than money, in sacrifice rather than charity, in purpose rather than pity. It's the story of Frank Thompson, factory worker, father, philanthropist in work boots who gave away more than most people ever earn and counted himself rich because of it. It's the story of Victoria, who learned that where you come from matters less than where you're going, but that forgetting where you came from means losing where you're going. It's the story of sacrifice that looked like failure but was really success measured in different units, calculated in different currencies, valued in different markets than the ones that matter to people who've never had to choose between their dignity and their child's life. The reunion that day changed everything, not because of what I revealed, but because of what Victoria finally saw. What Marcus finally understood, what the family finally acknowledged, that Frank Thompson, the blue-collar embarrassment, the welfare case, the factory worker with chemical burns and calloused hands, was the richest man in the room, had always been the richest man in the room, would always be the richest man in any room where worth was measured in love rather than money. And that's a kind of welfare that doesn't come in envelopes, can't be torn up, and never runs out. The welfare of knowing you've lived a life worth living, loved with a love worth giving, and sacrificed for something worth saving. If you've made it this far in my story, you understand something about sacrifice, about love, about the choices we make and the prices we pay. Maybe you've been the Victoria in someone's life looking down on sacrifice you didn't understand. Maybe you've been the Frank, working thanklessly while those you love most are ashamed of what you do to show that love. Or maybe you're somewhere in between, trying to understand what really matters, what really counts, what really makes a life worth living. Whatever brought you here, whatever kept you reading, I hope you take away this. Love is not about words but actions. Wealth is not about having but giving. And the greatest welfare we can offer each other is understanding, respect, and the recognition that every sacrifice is a love song written in the language of choice. If this story touched you, if it made you think differently about the people in your life who sacrifice without recognition, if it reminded you that success has many faces and not all of them wear suits, then please, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like if it moved you, comment with your own story of sacrifice and love, of understanding finally dawning, of welfare that isn't about money but about meaning. And subscribe to hear more stories like this. Stories that remind us that the most ordinary people are often the most extraordinary, that the quietest love is often the fiercest, and that sometimes the best welfare check is the one that never gets cashed. Thank you for reading, for understanding, and for seeing that Frank Thompson is everywhere, in every factory, in every hospital, in every family where someone chooses sacrifice over comfort and calls it love.